What a great turnout for class, especially on a rainy Friday morning. I am very impressed. I want to welcome everyone to this special session of Government 54, United States Foreign and Military Policy. I want to remind the students who are actually in the class that Monday will be our first case discussion of the year on April Glaspie and the origins of the Persian Gulf War. So please read it carefully and come prepared for the discussion. And now I want to turn things over to Ambassador Dan Benjamin, the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth, who's going to moderate today's proceedings.
Thank you very much. I'll just be very brief. I want to welcome you to this, shall we say, enlarged class as well, and thank you all for attending. I particularly want to thank Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis for taking time out. Appearances to the contrary, he's actually a pretty busy guy, and we are enormously honored that he has taken time out of his schedule to be here. I particularly also want to thank former President Jim Wright, who's unfortunately not here, and Trustee Emeritus Peter Robinson for arranging this and for helping us put it all together. You know, we live in a pretty tumultuous and polarized time. That's not going to come as news to anyone. And we have disagreements on just about everything. President Kennedy used to like to say, and this is not meant as an insult to any of my colleagues, but that if you took all the economists in the world and you laid them end to end, you would not reach a conclusion. I think if you took all of the pundits, journalists, politicians on both sides of the aisle today and you laid them all end to end, you might reach the conclusion that the one person who best embodies American values in public life and who represents our continued hope for the furtherance of freedom, democracy, and human rights is Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. And those of us who have worked with him in the past have not been surprised by this, but we are totally thrilled by his perseverance, his dedication, and the enormous personal sacrifice he's making by serving the nation like this. And finally, I just want to say that he should also know that if he decides he wants to do something else, we do have room for him at the Dickey Center. With that, let me turn it over to President Phil Hanlon, who will formally introduce our guest.
Thanks, Dan. And Secretary Mattis, it doesn't usually take so many people to introduce someone, but in your case, I know we're all anxious to hear from our distinguished guests, so I will be brief. But on behalf of everyone at Dartmouth, it is an enormous honor to welcome to campus the 26th U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis. And I want to thank Dan Benjamin and echo Dan's thanks to President Emeritus Jim Wright and Trustee Emeritus Peter Robinson for helping us set up this visit. Secretary Mattis has been described as the most revered soldier of his generation. He's had a storied career in uniform with commands in conflicts from the Gulf War through Operation Iraqi Freedom. He received his 4th star in 2007 and in 2010 was appointed commander of the Central Command, which covers all U.S. operations from Afghanistan to Egypt. And so at those moments when the complexity of being president of Dartmouth start to get me down, I just try to think of what it must have been like to have been in his shoes overseeing Central Command, and I feel immediately better. So in January 2017, General Mattis was confirmed as U.S. Secretary of Defense by a 98-1 vote in the U.S. Senate. In his current office, Secretary Mattis has been a powerful force supporting the alliances that help maintain the global order that has prevented the kinds of wars we saw in the first half of the 20th century. And he has remained vigilant against the challenge of rival powers who seek to erode American influence within that order. And as you may know, Secretary Mattis has visited Dartmouth before. And on that earlier occasion, I remember him telling me how much he enjoyed engaging with Dartmouth students. I'm not surprised by that, but I'm delighted that he has come back for more. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us at this moment in our nation's history. The podium is all yours.
Well, Thank you, Mr. President, very much. I owe Dartmouth a debt. When I was unemployed, Ambassador Benjamin offered me a spot, and so I don't forget my debts. But all the trustees, the faculty members who are here, distinguished faculty, I know that from having associated with you for those wonderful 30 days up here in the wilderness that I spent among you. It's great to be back, and most importantly, to the whole reason for this institution, the students. I always look forward to seeing you for the refreshing questions and challenges you bring, but also it gives hope to all of us that this big experiment that we call America is going to be put in very, very good hands. Some things are work and some are pleasure. I'll tell you right up front, this one is pleasure to come up here and see you. It's a genuine pleasure. I would tell you, too, that we have a beautifully imperfect experiment that we call America, and we're going to need all of you as we make this country work. We're still building a country here, and I just really appreciate you allowing me to spend a few minutes with you here. I'm sure that I'm going to walk out of here today with some new ideas, some fresh ideas from your questions, and I'll try and talk just long enough to kind of close the gap between us. I've written my remarks out here so I don't start waxing too eloquent and take all the time for me talking. But if you get tired of listening, before I get tired of talking, you raise your hand, and after I swear you in as a private in the Marine Corps, we'll go to your Q&A. That way it should work. And I do come before you, frankly, with mixed emotions. To be out of Washington, D.C., I'm so happy I could cry. So don't worry if I have a tear or two up here. To Peter Robinson, old friend of years now, thanks for your service to our country. The words that you used did prove mightier than the sword. For those who ever doubt that old saying, and helped end the Cold War in no uncertain terms, and will be forever remembered like that. All of us who lived through those days remember those words, and they came to characterize our time as much as what John F. Kennedy said when he also was at that location. But also for your many keen insights together. I think you're a role model of a Dartmouth graduate who cherishes his citizenship in America and who married his intellect to the good fortune of our country, to the protection of our values. And to Ambassador Dan, I've got to tell you all here that this often self-effacing, quiet ambassador, top scholar, as you all know, he's a master of the art of diplomacy, but thanks for all your labors there as the counterterrorism person, since 95% of your problems came out of my zone. Obviously, you showed a deep sense of understanding as you worked with us in our rather voracious appetite to go after that enemy, but do it in a way that kept our country's honor clean. And I would say that having caused you all that heartache when you invited me up, I felt duty bound to report in and at least try to pay you back. But actually, ladies and gentlemen, we had a very, very tight-knit civilian military team, thanks to the ambassador's sense of collaboration. I did get out of the Marines for a few years. Some of you are aware I left under other than positive circumstances. I have bear no rancor to the president whatsoever from those days. But then I flunked my retirement program, as good as it was out there, Peter, where they don't even turn the coffee pot on until 9:30 in the morning. That was heaven on earth for me. And I would just tell you that as we look at our rather raucous capital in Washington right now, to come up here where you can reflect, to listen to people who have time to study under a faculty that's distinguished by its excellence, this, for me, will get us to the best part of today, and that is your Q&A. I want to focus a little bit on what we're doing to protect the Constitution in the Department of Defense and to protect the American people, and then close by touching on your irreplaceable role as citizens here in this country. You are the connective tissue between the military and other parts of our democracy. And why is that? Because the U.S. military belongs to all of you. I say it's your military because under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, it's very clear who we belong to. And I did not serve in the Marine Corps for 43 years. I served in the U.S. Marine Corps, accountable to you. for what we did. A little of my background: I was born and raised on the banks of the Columbia River out in the Pacific Northwest. I was raised by the greatest generation that came home from World War II and had lived through the Depression. You can imagine those formative experiences had certain impacts on their view of the world. And I joined the Marine Corps and the Marine Infantry at age 18 as probably the world's least accomplished draft dodger. At 21, by the time I was 21, I was overseas as an infantry platoon commander with my sailors and Marines. I will tell you, I didn't always like my jobs in the Marine Corps. I grew to hate minefields at a very young age, but I loved being around young lads who would bite their lips so hard it would bleed, but still crawl forward looking for something with a long knife, looking for something they didn't want to find, knowing that their buddies behind them were counting on them to get them through there. And their commitment, the willingness at that young age, infantry officer, and infantry is named infant soldier, young soldier, most of them not old enough to buy a beer legally. Their selfless commitment is what kept me around the Marine Corps in that low-paying outfit all those decades. So let me talk to you now. You know where I'm coming from, how we in Department of Defense carry out the mission today that goes all the way back to George Washington before we even had a country. We had a Revolutionary Army, we had an Army, a Navy, a Marine Corps before we had a country. America today, ladies and gentlemen, is emerging from a period of strategic atrophy. I would even call it a time when we had no strategy at all. It kind of comes in at the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We think we're living in an age of peace. 9/11 changes that, but we didn't impose a strategic view in many ways. This is not a partisan statement. It's Republican and Democrat administrations have been in power during those years. But today, while terrorism's clear and present danger, it remains a significant threat. Great power competition today, great power competition is now our primary challenge, and it's increasingly clear that China and Russia seek to shape the world consistent with their authoritarian models. There is no reason to think that China, with its authoritarian model at home, and those of us who've been there have seen it in action, there's no reason to think that when they reach out externally that they're going to suddenly embrace an open, transparent, just, democratic model that allows all nations, large and small, weak and strong, an equal voice, such as the United Nations Charter promotes. I think, too, that if we try to replace the free and open order that people like John Sloan Dickey and others of the greatest generation built after World War II, if they try to replace it with something, we have to be very, very shy of joining up with that and look very carefully at what they're doing. We look, frankly, for ways to cooperate with China, and you see that in the United Nations, where we have voted unanimously in the Security Council to denuclearize the Korea Peninsula, but we confront China where we must. For example, the militarization of the South China Sea, a situation we inherited when we came into office with this administration. But the bottom line is it's a strategically uncomfortable relationship, but it's one that has got to be there. We can't say we're simply going to go with confrontation. We've seen how that worked out during the 20th century, as was mentioned by the president. We certainly don't need to see that kind of ignorance leading us forward, but at the same time, we have to confront them and cooperate where we can. You saw that where last year we invited China to take part in the largest naval exercise in the world. We do this, RIMPAC it's called. It's a U.S.-led exercise in the Pacific. It's got dozens of nations. We bring the navies together, and transparently we work together. We show each other what we're doing. We reduce misunderstanding. We increase understanding. And China invited to it, and then in direct contravention to the promise President Xi had made in the Rose Garden to President Obama that he would not militarize the Spratly Islands. A month before RIMPAC, they decided to militarize it. So I said, fine, you must not want to be in RIMPAC. You're out. In other words, it's uncomfortable. You see what I'm driving? That's a tactical exposure of just how uncomfortable it can be. And by the way, I was in Beijing 2 weeks later, and the relationship is quite fine. They understood it. There was no gnashing of teeth or rending of garments. But at the same time, there's some things we have to be very clear that we stand for. And then we have to be equally clear what we will not stand for. Earlier this year, we released our first national defense strategy. And the first time, by the way, I was interviewed about it publicly was with a Dartmouth grad leading the interview that was streamed live. Peter, thank you again. We only have 3 lines of effort, ladies and gentlemen. You know, I was getting on the plane coming out of Denver, going back in the end of December of 2016, thinking I've got to go in front of the Congress, the Senate, to be confirmed. What is it you want to do with, you know, this important part of our government? And the 3 lines of effort I decided on is, first, we're going to restore military readiness and lethality. There can be no misunderstanding that democracies can fight like the Dickens if they have to do so. So lethality, everything we do, personnel policies, what weapons, what communications, tactics, techniques, how do we deal with outer space, it's all based on lethality and being a major force in the defense of our values. What I want our adversaries to know is, please work with our State Department. You really don't want to work with me. That's the message, you see what I'm driving at. And why do I do it? Because I want them to know it'll be their longest and their worst day if they take us on. And we'll come out swinging, and free women and men can fight like the Dickens if we're threatened. And there's other people who thought by hurting us on 9/11 they could scare us. Well, the U.S. military doesn't scare, and you'll notice they've not been able to hit us since then due to some imperfect but active operations that we are still engaged in today. Our second line of effort is the one that I spend most of my personal time on, and that is copying the efforts of the greatest generation coming home from World War II, who said it's a crummy world, but we're part of it, whether we like it or not. We are making stronger and more partnerships and allies. And I have now visited my 60th country. It has amazed me that everywhere I go, from NATO to Sweden and Finland to Mexico to India, Vietnam, I can go on and on. They want stronger relations with the United States. Now, I know underneath the headlines you see every day, you'd say, wow, that's not what I'm picking up. Believe me, I wish I could carry you in my suitcase as I travel the world and you could see it. It is humbling. It is so forthcoming that you wonder, you know, if you're living with the real world when you come back to Washington, D.C. and you watch what's on the news. But, you know, that's part of the political scrum that I try to keep the Department of Defense out of. We defend America. We do not take sides on the political piece of it. In fact, the young men and women who join, by and large, they look past the hot political rhetoric and they rally to the colors, and they're there because they want to be. It's not easy working with allies. Winston Churchill said the only thing harder than fighting alongside allies with allies is fighting without allies, and I would agree. I had the privilege over many, many years to fight for America, and I never fought in an all-American formation. I have never fought where it was just Americans running. It's always been alongside allies, and we needed every one of them. On that front, I will tell you the one thing that counts is trust, and without trust, you cannot have allies. And so we work hard in a world increasingly characterized, defined by a lack of trust to maintain it. And so far, we have been much more successful than I would have anticipated as I looked at some of the rhetoric being passed around the world from all sorts of directions. I also make it very clear for my officers, if you cannot build that trust across civilian military lines, across national lines, then your leadership is obsolete. You got to go home. You've got to be able to build that trust with our diplomats. First thing I do when I fly into a country is I check in with the ambassador. I say, what can I do to help you? That's the way we've got to work together as foreign policy is driven by State Department and supported by the Department of Defense, not led by military factors in the Department of Defense. We have to be willing to be persuaded by our allies, not just listen to them. Not all the good ideas come from the country with the most aircraft carriers, but whether it's counterterrorism or freedom of navigation, humanitarian and disaster relief operations, we always look to see what allies can do, not what they can't do. Okay, a lot of the allies are not as capable of us militarily, but they have something to offer, and I've always found that we needed them on the battlefield. Now, we're always going to have disagreements among allies. That's normal. And there's nothing all that new under the sun about it. Anyone who thinks the disagreements in NATO are somehow new today didn't read that 6-7 years after NATO was established, the French and the British paratroopers jumped in and seized the Suez Canal and the Israelis from Egypt. And President Eisenhower was very blunt. He said, you will get out of there. You will get out of Egypt. You have no business being there. And think about that now. They're actually engaged in a fight, and we're saying we're not with you. And NATO survived that. NATO will survive what we're doing today as well. The reality is that allies have often now recognized the dangers that are confronting them, and they too have their internal processes. Countries that don't want to spend more on defense, understandable. We all need more money for schools, and we all need more money for health care. But democracies standing together certainly can keep these democracies alive a lot better than ones trying to stand alone. Our third line of effort is one about reforming and modernizing Department of Defense. There I had to bring, this is not my strength, and knowing your weaknesses is good. I brought in the weirdest guy I ever met. He's an engineer who loves people. You know what I mean? You ever heard of that before? Crazy, you know? But brought him in from Boeing Company, a young engineer who saved their 787 program from dying on the computer screen. And I said, I can only offer you a 95% pay cut, but don't worry about it because you work 7 days a week, so you don't have any time to go shopping anyway. And I said, and just for added measure, we'll drag your name through the mud in the front page of the newspaper every so often to insult you. He said, play me, I'm all game. He's that kind of person. He's unintimidated. So he's in there working to make certain that the money we get is spent correctly. It creates lethality. It links us more with our allies. It takes into account space and cyberspace. And nothing could be more characteristic of his success than a couple days ago, the vote in the Senate appropriations to give us a record-breaking appropriations level, recognizing the Senate now very keenly aware of the threat briefed to them by the CIA and of how I intend using my strategy to spend the money. 93-7, they voted for that appropriations bill. So that gives you an idea that in a Washington that's alive with partisanship, here you see Republicans and Democrats working hand in hand to take care of their military. So you'll always hear about the parts where nobody gets along and nothing's going well, and that's the part that makes the television screen every day. In fact, I've got a lot of bipartisan support, and it's stayed that way through some difficult times over the last 18, 19 months. We do have to spend the money wisely. Believe it or not, DOD, 17th largest economy in the world, I'm told, has never had an audit. Well, guess what? I don't have stress. I create it. We're doing an audit this year. It's costing me a lot of money. We're going to find problems, and I'm going to parade every one of them out and tell Congress there's the problem, and I'm going to fix them, and we're going to make certain that this outlives my time at the Department of Defense so that we have a Department of Defense that I can look you in the eye and say, we are not wasting your money and we're spending it the way we should for protecting America. Let me just talk to you for a bit about what I mentioned in my opening remark, your irreplaceable role. Dartmouth has a long, long history of service to our country. Many of you are aware of it, and it certainly, in our mind, as outsiders look at Dartmouth, supplants any idea that you can go to certain schools and make more at the 10-year or the 30-year mark of money than you will if you go to other schools. We see that your service to our country, in our mind, is what defines this school. We'll see if you are worthy of that, if you're willing to work for your country at the same level that previous have. But remember, you hold the legacy of this school in your hands, in usufruct, so to speak. The idea that Thomas Jefferson used to write about, you get the farm, you can chop down the trees, you can change the water course, you can plant crops, you do whatever you want with the land, but you must turn it over to your daughter or son in as good a condition or better than you received it. I just suggest you have a responsibility to turn Dartmouth's legacy over in as good a condition or better than you received it. I think that when you go out to the gravestone and look at the gravestones in Dartmouth Cemetery, the Revolutionary War gravestones. If you look at the Webster Hall, the plaque there honoring those fought in the Civil War to your memorial field, you see why you've got the reputation you have by those of us who were not so fortunate to come here. More than half of the Dartmouth class of 1942 served in World War II, and the valedictorian was killed in action only months after he gave the speech here. And also, when you look at the leading role that people like John Sloan Dickey played those years at State, there's a reason why he's remembered so fondly and with such admiration, seeing how he helped shape our foreign policy at very pivotal moments when we could have gone the wrong direction. And it took people who were committed to really mastering them, not just dabbling in it, to guide this country forward. Certainly, Peter, your words on behalf of President Reagan brought about one of the greatest geopolitical victories for freedom in the 20th century. And I bring that up because words matter in this world, and the better words will eventually triumph in most of the debates. And in this case, it was a worldwide, a global debate about who was the good guys and who was not. And it was we have to have people who are unapologetic about those values we stand for, and thank you for that leadership and continuing the legacy. We need that kind of service from all of you. We need America's best and brightest engaged in strengthening our country. Now, there's many, many ways to do that, put others first, to serve others first. But certainly the military, the one that I represent, I would challenge you to consider it and not be the parrot sitting on somebody's shoulder parroting whatever you've heard if you've been given either a disdainful or a suspicious view of the military. Go meet the veterans on your campus, draw your own conclusions. We're so proud of what we are and so transparent. We're very confident that if you see the reality, as long as you don't listen to people with my color hair who may have, some view of the military that's about 4 decades out of touch with reality, then we're quite comfortable we can compete with anybody out there in terms of, in the long run, you won't be laying on your back at age 45 asking some stranger at $100 an hour, what did you do with your life? I think we call it cherishing citizenship, and it is a two-way street. And one of the reasons I came up here is to make certain that I'm in a position to hear your concerns. But we do need democracies, and we do need democracies that then need defenders. You need the democratic way of life. It's imperfect, but it's better than any of the other options out there. And we need people who are willing to defend it, who look past any hot political rhetoric for the core functions. I think that many of the people I served with daily say no to some of the things that are fun. They go to uncomfortable places, they go into danger, and they do it at a very young age that helps set their course for the rest of their life. And I would tell you, too, they understand that committing to something greater than themselves in no way diminishes themselves. It actually enlarges it beyond what they could have imagined, because they received some very privileged glimpses into the human heart when you're out in the field or out at sea with the U.S. military. Let me just give you one example. I mean, I was an old guy when this lesson was brought home to me. I'm out. I'm a 2-star, and I've got 29 sailors and Marines go everywhere with me. They're with me day and night. We sleep next to each other. They're young sailors and Marines who run my communications. They're bodyguards, machine gunners, drivers, that sort of thing. We're in 4 vehicles. And one time we were out in the western Euphrates River Valley. It's a terrible area. 17 of those 29 sailors and Marines will be killed during this 4-month period. And we're outnumbered, and it's in a place called the Sunni Triangle. It's a tough fight. In the middle of the night, because we were delayed getting there, we pull inside a little perimeter of 40 sailors and Marines under a second lieutenant out in the middle of nowhere. There's nobody nearby. I mean, there's miles from anywhere, but it's a route that the terrorists are using to come in from Syria, and these young lads' job is to block it. So we get there, and when the sun comes up, we're inside his perimeter. Lieutenant comes over and checks in, normal stuff. And he said, we caught a guy putting an IED on the road you drove in last night. I said, really? That's kind of personal, you know? And he said, yes, he's an engineer, speaks perfect English. You want to meet him? I said, absolutely. So I bring him over, sits down, and he's just shaking like a leaf. You know, obviously it was not a good night for him. He's down there, he's got a wheelbarrow, had 2 artillery rounds, they showed it to me, car battery, and he looks up and there's 5 guys with automatic rifles standing around him. At that point, he realizes his 401k is in jeopardy, and he's probably going to have a little problem. So I had him cut off with little plastic handcuffs, and to get him a cup of coffee, he's spilling it on himself. He's so nervous and everything. And we're talking, you know, where do you live and stuff, and he doesn't want to say much. I said, what are you doing this for? I mean, you're Sunni, we're the Marines, we're the only friends you've got out here. What are you trying to kill us for? He started going, oh, you Jews and you American, you're here to steal the oil and stuff. I said, yeah, right. I said, you're obviously an educated man. Turned out he'd been in Switzerland for engineering school, by the way. I said, if you're going to talk like that, just go away. I don't want to waste my time. And he said, well, can I sit here for a minute? I said, sure. So he sits there and asks for a cigarette. And usually I'd give my anti-smoking lecture, but I figured I'd give him a break at this point, you know. So we found somebody with a cigarette. Not many of the lads smoke anymore, and had to light it for him. And I asked him about his family and told him he's got a wife and 2 daughters and everything, lived about 10 kilometers away. And I said, why are you doing this? He said, well, he said, you know, I just don't like having foreign soldiers here. I understand. I respect that. I wouldn't want, how would you like to have foreign soldiers on the streets of Hanover? You know, we wouldn't like it either. I say, okay, I got it. And we talked for a little while longer. And at one point he said, so I guess I'm going to go to jail. I said, oh, yeah. You're lucky that you're not dead right now, but you're going to Abu Ghraib. You're going to be wearing an orange jumpsuit for a long time for this little stunt. But now listen to this, my fine young students. Remember this. Out in the middle of the western Euphrates River Valley, he'd run into America's power of intimidation, and that's what we were. And let's be right up front. We're not always the nice guys when we come. But he said, do you think, General, if I'm a model prisoner, someday I could immigrate to America? Think about that. Literally trying to kill us. Power of intimidation, we're strong. But even stronger for America was the power of inspiration, and it could reach all the way out there and reach him, a guy engaged like that. So I would just tell you that when you when you get into these kind of circumstances, excuse me, you have to remember that America is still something unique. There's people who are going to try and convince you it isn't. There's people teaching hyphenated history who will try and convince you that somehow that we're one uncheckered bad country or something. It's all baloney. The people, if you didn't have any customs or anything else, this country would be tilting under the number of people who would rush to live here, including a guy who literally was so angry he's trying to kill us. So you just remember that example. And remember, too, that the greatest generation is called that, not just for what they fought against fascism in World War II, and at great, enormous cost, they squashed it, but also for what they did after World War II to try to set up the international order that the president mentioned in his opening remarks. And one of those guys that we all wanted to be when I was growing up was a sparkling baseball player named Jackie Robinson. We all wanted to slide into home plate like him. We all thought he was a courageous guy. He was like God on earth to those of us who wanted to play ball. And one winter when I was a 3-star, I went up to Cypress Hills Cemetery in January when it was raining and sleeting because I wanted to see his tombstone because he carved his own epitaph. And that greatest generation, World War II combat veteran, wonderful, sparkling, beautiful baseball player wrote, "A life is not important except in the impact it has on other lives." And I think that's enduring wisdom from a World War II combat veteran. So let me stop there. I am ready to hand out enlistment papers as soon as you want them. But let me stop there and let's go to Q&A here and have some fun.
Secretary, thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask one quick question. Professor Mastanduno will ask one question, and then we'll open it up. And I just want everyone to know that this actually still is a class. And those who are members of the class should raise their hands if they have questions. But that was a great primer both on so many issues, citizenship and where we are in the world and the rest. And this is not specifically a political science question, but one of the things that's not so well known about you is you're actually a pretty devoted reader. And I remember being down in Tampa and visiting some of the generals' houses, which are quite impressive. And everyone said, yeah, but you should see Mattis's. He's like camping in one room and then has thousands of books in the rest of the house. Doesn't use the whole house. And I was just wondering if you would reflect on the role that reading has had in terms of your career and where you would advise students to look for guidance as they build their own.
Yeah, lots of good ideas in old books. In the Marine Corps, you're required to read a different set of books at each rank. Sergeants read one set, all Marines read one. As you get promoted, you get a new reading list. Even generals get a new list of books they have to read. And I was under people who made that rather mandatory by putting me in my BOQ room all weekend if I'd fallen behind in my reading. But a sergeant major had told me once, said, in those days they called young officers in the Naval Service Mr. So, Mr. Mattis, you're rather persuasive at times. You make sure you've done your homework so you don't get people killed. And that stuck with me. So, excuse me, it got a little bit of a sore throat here. So I believe that you can do a lot better job if you know how other people in history have dealt with similar situations, either successfully or unsuccessfully. And especially in a job where young infantrymen are going to pay with their lives if you get it wrong, and you will get it wrong sometimes in combat. That's all there is to it. But it worked so well for me over the years that, for example, an admiral leaned across a table out in Bahrain one night about midnight, and he said, the enemy's going to lose Mazar-i-Sharif. This is after 9/11. And no one in history has held Kabul. So they're going to fall back on Kandahar, and everything's going to go wrong for us. And he said, we can either make this go right or go wrong. Can you get the Marines from the Pacific Fleet and the Mediterranean move against Kandahar and take it? I said, yeah, I can do that. He says, okay, here's an airplane. You go do your reconnaissance. And as I flew over that night with those sailors looking down, I could see the fighting up north, and I could see the fighting over to the east, and a big dark spot down below Kandahar. And as clearly as I can see you right now, I didn't care how fast they could run. I didn't care how many guns they had. I didn't care about anything. I could see how I was going to stick a knife in their back. So the way to make 4 stars, by the way, y'all take notes now, fight enemy generals dumber than a bucket of rocks, okay? So the reading had armed me. I had no idea that 20, 30 years later, I'd be flying over Afghanistan after the attack on our country, and it would pay off the way it did. But the fact is, the reading armed me to do that, and I didn't lose one sailor or Marine getting 2,000 troops into that fight. I lost troops later, but I didn't lose any getting them in. It was because of that. So the readings really paid off for me.
Secretary Mattis, thank you so much, especially for a return visit to Government 54, being your second time here. I think you're going to get a lot of questions about the substance of American foreign policy. I wanted to ask you one about process, because that's what we're working on in class this week. And we've talked about how different presidents organize the executive bureaucracy for the conduct of foreign policy, and some rely on the State Department and the Secretary of State. Some try to run foreign policy out of the White House, rely on a national security advisor. But every president does it their own way. Now, you've been in this administration for almost 2 years. What do you see as the signature features of the Trump administration's approach to the conduct of foreign policy?
Yeah, well, every president has got to be given the freedom to lead in their own style. We have an unusual president. We all see that right now. He challenges every assumption, but once he's given the options, and it's usually a very blunt and very demanding process, he gets basically from his national security staff. Initially, it was Director of CIA Pompeo and Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates who would lay out the situation. Now, the new Director of CIA is a long-serving CIA officer, Gina Haskell. So she does that with Dan Coates. And then initially it was Secretary Rex Tillerson and I. Now it's Secretary Pompeo. We come forward and we, with State Department and Defense, we always settle our differences before we walk into the White House. So State and Defense are aligned. We have a frequent breakfast with now it's obviously Ambassador Bolton, so that too is opened, and we try by avoiding groupthink to keep the intel folks out of that part, so they're constantly evaluating us as well, and then we move forward, and you can see what we've done. We've, for example, the acceleration of the campaign against ISIS. It was done based on an intelligence assessment that they were nowhere near finished. They could even recover from what had happened to them. So we switched from, when I came in, I changed the tactics from attrition with full understanding from CIA and assessment from CIA. They red teamed it to annihilation. We would take the time to surround where they were at, not simply push against them, surround each location, the intention being to wipe them out. Because if they escaped, they were a big danger on the streets of Brussels or the streets of Paris or wherever they were going, Islamabad, New Delhi. I mean, these were dangerous people. Once they'd gone into this situation, the veneer of civilization is pretty much wiped off them. So we had to make it compelling that other people not recruit, not give money for them. They had to see them as losers. That was an example of how this process worked. Intelligence-driven, state and defense getting together, changing the military tactics to support the foreign policy. And they're down right now to a little under 2%. And about 7 hours ago, another attack went in as we try to close in on the last of them. It's going to be a very tough fight because now they're compressed, and there's a lot of them in a small area. But that gives you an example of how you go from the theory and which issues you're going to engage on to what is the process that gets you to that effect on the ground.
Okay, questions? Let's start over here. The microphone is coming your way.
Speaking of Syria, what are the long-term grand strategy plans that the administration has for the SDF? Will Trump be using it to counterbalance the Assad regime?
Say the last part again.
Will the Trump administration be using it to counterbalance the Assad regime?
Okay, what we're doing in Syria right now, as you're aware, there's a civil war going on in Syria. Assad, people came out demonstrating against him. It goes back years, what we called the Arab Spring. He did what his father did. He began gunning them down the streets. That created a civil war. They didn't like that, obviously. They began arming. And into this chaos, and at least one of our bosses in the old days, she warned that if we don't help certain people, then the good Syrians are going to get rubbed out between the terrorists who will start coming into this chaos and the Assad regime. Regrettably, Secretary Clinton was proven correct. So the situation we face is, under a UN mandate, we are fighting in Syria in one aspect, and that is the defeat of ISIS. We have altogether about 70 some odd nations and international organizations like Arab League, European Union, NATO, Interpol, plus 67 or 68 nations, whatever it is, all working together to defeat ISIS. We are the leaders of that, which is understandable, but that is why we are there now. We have done that by allying with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are probably 50-50 Kurd and Arab. Our goal is to support the political end state, which goes to the heart of your first question, is to support the Geneva process, in other words, the UN designated process to end the civil war there while ensuring ISIS cannot recover. We will stay with SDF as we stand up local Arab and Kurd police forces so that ISIS cannot come back in the area that we're in. In the rest of the area, where the Assad regime continues its murder with the help of Russia's regrettable vetoes in the UN and the Iranian Soleimani and the Quds Force and the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, there's a difference, the Iranian regime's efforts, they continue to basically deflect the UN's designated way out of this and Staffan de Mistura's leadership in trying to end this war. Putin has also done it with his Astana process, which is deflected from the UN process. So it's a very complex situation, and our diplomats are working hard to get this into that political solution. We do not see our role there being part of the civil war, with one exception. We made very clear within a month of coming in to office that if they used chemical weapons, we would go after them. And we went after them the first time, and we went after them the second time. They lost 17% of their Air Force the first time, and then they lost their research and development capability on chemical weapons the second time. First time we were alone, but as we stood up and said, this is where we stand, the second strike, the French and the British are with us, and by the way, a lot of other nations are with us, but don't have the military capability to go in. And we've been telegraphing and messaging very clearly to Assad, do not use chemical weapons. You may say, well, what's the difference for the poor people being bombed? Remember, every battlefield in this world is also a humanitarian field. And I can't argue with you on that, but we are not willing to put our troops into the midst of that civil war. We are trying to get the international community to stop this. And unfortunately, the Russians and Iranians have kept Assad in power long past his shelf life. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming to talk to us. I was just wondering if we could hear more about your perspective on the Space Force.
Yeah, the Space Force. You know, it's interesting. The Air Force has 2 4-star generals right now who've done nothing but space. And so when I hear that we haven't focused on space, who you put stars on tells you who the military reward, where their interest lies, okay? We have more satellites in space. We're the most capable in space of anybody. Regrettably, we see other nations now trying to militarize it. We got the message loud and clear here about 10 years ago when China went up and shot one of their derelict satellites out of the air. They didn't have to do that and make space debris all over the place. That was to send a message. We got the message. I was born at night, but not last night, okay? So what we have to do is recognize that we've probably become less oriented on the defense of our assets in space. We would put satellites up there with the idea that they could not be attacked, that this was part of arms control agreements, that we'd watch each other and would help build the trust. Remember Reagan's trust but verify? That was one of the elements. And today we see space becoming contested very clearly. And we've got, obviously we read our adversaries' mail and we know what their plans are. So we're going to have to organize for it. First step is to have, I have a combatant commander is what it's called for the Pacific, for Europe, for Latin America. We're going to have a combatant commander for space. In fact, we have an organization that does that now. We have to broaden their mandate, and I can do that on my own authority. And I'm in the process of doing that. We came in, and we're the ones who brought the lack of attention to space to President Trump's attention. We weren't quite ready for some of the things he did, but we are not philosophically we are not out of step or non-aligned with it at all. He wants a separate force now. I have no reservations about that. What I want to do, like Einstein used to say, what would you do if you had an hour to save the world? He said, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem, then save the world in 5 minutes. We want to make certain we've defined the problem so I don't just create one more bureaucracy I want to make certain it delivers protection to the American people, which is primarily, by the way, commerce and also military. Commerce is the priority, by the way. So we're going to have a force organized along those lines. We were already doing it. If we go to a Space Corps, I will need something like the Marine Corps has been likened to. I will need congressional authority. You know how our government's organized, and we're already engaged in defining what that legislation would look like, and we'll be engaging in a lot of discussion with Congress, but we are going to be a lot better in space when I leave this job than when I came in. That help will give you a little idea how I'm looking at it? Yeah, thanks for the, well, as a matter of fact, come on in.
Well, first off, thanks for taking the time to chat with our class today. We really appreciate it, and of course, for your service to our country. There was a video that went viral of you last year talking to a small group of Marines that where you remarked, it was really inspirational, but where you remarked that, you know, they were the face of our country, and you advised them to kind of hold the line through this like tumultuous political era. And you know, in response, a number of observers in Washington kind of group you in as one of these like adults in the room who oftentimes like works to check the president's worst impulses. And I was wondering if that's how you saw your role in this administration, and yeah, it's kind of the basis of it.
Yeah, the short answer is no. This administration, you know, just look at what I have in my own department. You know, the Boeing's top guy. I've got, you know, Ellen Lord, who is the CEO of Textron Corporation, in to run my acquisition. I mean, she's been to the top of one hierarchy. There's no ego. It's just, what can I do for the country? I've got the former head of NASA in as my research and engineering guy. I can go on. So that's just in the Department of Defense, and none of them think they're going to come into government service and burnish their image. We're just living in a time when that doesn't happen. I seldom go to restaurants in Washington, D.C. anymore. It's interruptive of the poor people sitting around me. I think that when you look at the broader who's in, Senator Dan Coates, you know, former ambassador as the Director of National Intelligence, we have very open discussions with the president. When I was talking about holding the line, it's probably the same talk that people like Sherman gave at Shiloh. It's the same talk that MacArthur gave in the Philippines in early 1942. It's the same talk that we have always given to those who are going to go into what we call the close quarters fight, where it's even the most articulate Supreme Court justice in our history, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., said it's an incommunicable experience. And I'm not the most articulate person. I was just trying to tell him, you just hold the line. I will tell you that I think it is a concern that we are losing our fundamental respect, our fundamental friendliness for one another as Americans. And I'm very proud to say the U.S. military is not perfect. But where's the first time, when is the first time, where was the first time that a man and a woman, a black man, a white man, an American Indian all voted as equals in American history? It was on a long-range U.S. Army patrol in President Jefferson's administration. We call it the Lewis and Clark Expedition. So there is something about a military that gets you. I remember talking to a couple of lads coming back from taking their bath in an irrigation ditch, and they were soaking wet, their uniform and everything. The only thing that was really clean and shiny were their weapons. And I was walking over to catch up with my guys, say, "How you guys doing?" And they said, "Living the dream, General, living the dream, you know. No Maserati, no problem, you know." Their sense of liberation, that they could be stripped down and doing something they knew was important, and they were going on patrol that night. These are not dumb kids. These are young guys who tie tourniquets around their legs, so if their leg gets blown off, they can snap it shut quickly on their own with one hand. These were young veterans. They might have been 19, but they knew what they're doing. And to be around people like that, you need to give them a very clear view of what they're doing. They hold the line until we get back to a friendliness toward a respect for one another. and that sort of thing. So no, it had nothing to do. I saw it get misinterpreted, but you know, if I say 6 and the president says half a dozen, I guarantee you the article the next day is going to be Secretary of Defense and the president disagree on the fundamental. Obviously not Dartmouth grads, you know what I mean?
We have time for one more question. I'm going to go right here in the middle.
Where? Where?
No, right here, right here. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. You mentioned repeatedly that you work closely with the the State Department, and follow their lead on foreign policy. And I was just wondering if that relationship has been changed or challenged by the exodus they've had in the last couple of years.
No, my concern coming in was that America's foreign policy had become militarized over the last 20 years. That's not a political stand, that's Republican and Democrat. And I wanted State Department in the lead on foreign policy and that access. I meet weekly, have breakfast with Secretary Pompeo now, just like I did with Secretary Tillerson weekly. We talk on the phone 2 or 3 times a week. One is just a sync call, synchronize what we're doing, and the other times are specific issues. And our access to the president is actually absolutely unhindered. I can call him 24/7. He calls me routinely. And I would just tell you that, you know, I read even I'm not having hamburgers anymore. And I admit I didn't eat the French fries last week, but I did have the hamburger with the boss, okay? So no, it's going fine. You know, I love reading these stories about me, and they even know what I'm thinking at times, which I find quite enlightening, you know?
Very quickly, right here.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for coming out to speak with us. I'm Private First Class Hal. I serve in the Army Reserve. And my question for you is, what are the primary objectives of U.S. defense policy in both the short term and long term?
Short questions at the end.
The primary objective for me on a personal basis to turn over to the Secretary of Defense after next sufficient protections. In other words, we think far enough ahead that he enjoys the same degree of superiority if the enemy chooses to fight that I inherited. So that's what I've got to do, not the next secretary, the Secretary of Defense after next, okay? I would just tell you that I want more allies. I want stronger alliances. I want more like-minded nations knowing that we're willing to listen and work with them. I want more of a sign of respect, such as the great relationship we have with Canada and Mexico's militaries right now. I want that spreading around the world. I think we have to look, there's many different forms of government. I think so long as it's just and responsive to its people. I mean, the British have a queen, we don't. You know, we had a nasty argument with George III. We didn't want kings, you know. Other nations have sultans or prime ministers, and that means they're in a parliamentary type system. I'm more interested, do they have a responsive and just government, responsive to the needs of their people and just to all? And on that, I can start finding common ground. I do not look for a degree of perfection from these countries that we've not yet achieved in our own country. We're all working at this. And just in closing, I know I'm going to get yanked off here. You know, it is hard work, like I said, to build a country. It's noble work, but we're still building here. So don't ever take refuge in cynicism in the military when you say, oh, well, it's all screwed up, nothing you can do about it anyway. That's just another form of cowardice. We don't buy that. So don't take refuge in cynicism. Keep the faith and keep working on it. You'll go a long way to find a country more willing to call itself out and say, we're not there yet. But let's be careful not to use public humiliation around the world and then wonder why they resent it. I don't like it myself. There's ways to deal with people out of respect without apologizing or undercutting the values that you and I all stand for in this room. But let's make sure we're also practicing them here at home so we're a model for others of respect for each other, of hearing each other out, of not considering someone who has a different view of America's future as an enemy or a terrorist or something like that. Those kind of words are not helpful. Those kind of words, they do exactly what they're designed to do. They draw lines between people. And there's something in that coin you carry in your pocket, e pluribus unum, out of many one. I would just recommend to you that you look at any, in my case, Marine assault company going into a fight and see the number of different colors there. If you knew the religions, you'd see every religion, and those guys are going to bet their lives on each other. So let's keep betting our lives on each other, not on ourselves, okay? Let's go back to being what Americans were supposed to be when Abraham Lincoln said, let's listen to the better angels of our nature. Thanks very much for having me up today, ladies and gentlemen.